Hello, ladies and gentlemen. In this episode of our app development series, the concept we're going to focus on is animations. The animation I want to add to this app is I want to be able to click each list item and have it expand to give us a little bit more information. So when I click on the list item, what I want to do is have this little chevron icon rotate. So instead of pointing to the right, it'll be pointing down. And then I want the size of each list item to get a little bit bigger. And this is very similar to what the actual MLB app does, which is where I got the idea from. So in order to start using animations, we need to first import the animated library from React Native. So I'm going to add animated to my list of imports from React Native. And we're also going to need to use some icons. So I'm going to go ahead and import the material community icons as icon from React Native vector icons. And finally, since we're going to be animated an icon, we need to create an animated icon. So I'm going to say const animated icon equals animated dot create animated component, and I pass in the icon. And if you're wondering how I knew how to do that, it's because I went to the GitHub page for the React Native vector icons, and they actually tell you exactly how to do that for animated icons right here. All right, one of the downsides of using a UI library is if it doesn't have a feature you want, you may have to do a lot of extra work to get it to work. And we're using the React Native Elements UI library, which doesn't have this type of animation that we want by default, so we need to create it ourselves. Fortunately, this library is pretty flexible, so we'll have the ability to do it, hopefully. Since we're going to be expanding and collapsing these list items, I want to add a variable to my state called isExpanded, which will keep track of whether or not the list items are expanded or not. So I'm going to start that off as false. And as we discussed, there are two specific things we want to animate. One is the rotation of the icon here, and one is the size of the list item. So also in my constructor, I'm going to set up some animation values. So first I'm going to say this.chevron rotation equals, and we need to use this special animated.value. So I'll say new animated.value. And for the chevron rotation, it will handle the degrees of rotation, which we're starting off at 0 degree rotation. And we also want to create a property for the list item height, which is going to be a new animated.value. And we'll start the height off as 0, which you'll see why in a second, and then we'll expand that when we want to see more information. Okay, I'm going to scroll down to where we render the list item, and I'm going to register for the onPress event of this list item, because whenever the list item is pressed, that's when we want to trigger the expand or collapse. So I'll say onPress equals this.onListItemPress, and I'll implement that function right here, onListItemPress. And here is where we will perform the animations, which we'll do in just a few minutes. But at the very bottom, what I want to do at the very end of the press is to toggle my expanded state. So I'll say this.setState is expanded, and that's going to be equal to the opposite, or not this.state that is expanded. So since isExpanded starts off as false, when we run this function, it'll change it to not false, which is true, and it'll continue toggling that. So I will put a comment, toggle the isExpanded state. All right, fortunately, the React Native Elements UI library allows us to customize these list items quite a bit. And in fact, you can override almost every piece of content in the list item with your own custom component. And since we want to have animated components, that's what we're going to need to do. So let's start off with the icon. I'm going to replace the default chevron icon with our own custom animated icon. The way I can do that is by specifying the right icon property. And the reason that I knew all of this is because I looked it up on the React Native Elements documentation page, which gives pretty extensive documentation on how to do each thing. So here we're setting the right icon property. And you can see here it can take either some properties or an actual component. Okay, for the right icon, we're going to use an animated icon, not a standard icon, because we want this icon to be animated, obviously. So I'll set animated icon and I'll set the name equal to Chevron right, which is the same icon as this one. And I'll save and refresh to make sure that looks okay. And as you can see, the icon has now been replaced by our animated icon. However, the size and the color are a little bit off, so I'm going to update this to have a size of 30 and a color equal to gray. Save and refresh and make sure that looks okay. Perfect. It may not be exactly the way it was before, but I think it looks pretty good, and we can always make minor tweaks to it later. Okay, now we need to add the rotation animation. So I'm going to create a new function here, and this is going to be called get Chevron rotate style. And this is going to return a style object that has the rotation that we want built into it. So the first thing we need to do is set up the animation. So we'll create a constant called rotate, and now we're going to use the animated library. So we'll say this.chevron rotation, which remember was our animated.value, and we're going to type .interpolate. And the interpolate function takes an object with two properties. One of those is an input range, which is an array, and the other is an output range, which is also an array. The input range is typically just 0 and 1, or you could add more numbers if you want to have more control over the animation, and the output range is the actual values that we want to change. So we want to start from 0 degrees to 90 degrees. So basically we want to rotate from here. 90 degrees should be a rotation down, pointing directly down. Okay, and now we can return the style. So we will return a transform, and this is the way you can do using the kind of CSS type styles in React Native to perform various transformations. And this is an array, and we'll set rotate property equal to the rotate constant that we just created. All right, now down here in our render list item, we can get the Chevron style. So I'll create a constant here called Chevron Style, and I'll call this .get Chevron rotate style. That's going to give us the rotation style there. And then we need to apply that style to our animated icon. So let me add some new lines here for clarity. And I'm going to set my style equal to Chevron style. Okay, so now our animated icon has been given the rotation style, and all we need to do now is trigger the animation whenever the list item is clicked. As you can see, when I click it, it doesn't currently do anything. So I'm going to come back up to my onListItemPress function, and right here I'm going to say rotate the chevron, and here we will call the animated library functions from React Native. First thing we need to do is figure out our to value for our animation, because we can go back and forth between expanded and collapsed states. So if we're currently expanded, then we want to go to the collapsed state, so the new state we want to be at is 0 degrees. And if we're currently not expanded, then the state we want to go to is 90 degrees. So I'm going to create a variable here called chevron to value, and I'm going to use the ternary operator and check this.state.isExpanded. And if we are expanded, then the to value I want to get is 0, which corresponds to this input range of 0, which then gives us an output of 0 degrees. And if we are not expanded, then I want to go to value 1 right here. Okay, now we will call animated.timing, and we'll give the property that we want to animate. So it's this.chevron rotation. And then we give an object which has a to value, which is what we just figured out right here, the chevron to value. And it also takes a duration, which is how long you want the animation to last. And let's just choose 200. Finally, this isn't enough to actually trigger the animation. You need to call the .start function on it, and that should start the animation. So I'll save and refresh, and let's test it out. All right, now when I click on the list item, you can see that the chevrons are rotating down and to the right, depending on the state that I'm currently in. So this is all looking good so far. Okay, the next thing to do is to expand the list items themselves to make them bigger or smaller, depending on if we are in expanded mode or not. And the way that I think would be easiest to do this would be to give our list item a subtitle. So if we jump back over to the React Native Elements documentation and we look up subtitle, if I can find it in here, we can see that it takes either a string or an actual React element. So what we're going to do is have the subtitle be a full React element, and we'll put in whatever kind of extra information we want inside of that. And what we'll do is animate the height of that subtitle. We'll go from a 0 if we don't want it visible to maybe 100 if we want it to be, or whatever size we need it to be. So I'll come back into the code, and for the list item, I'm going to set the subtitle property here. And I'm going to actually make this a function to encapsulate it a little bit. So I'm going to create a new function called RenderSubtitle. And for now, we will just return a view with some text in it that says subtitle, just to make sure it's all working correctly. So now in our subtitle, why don't I create right here another constant called subtitle, and we'll say this.render subtitle. And in the subtitle property, I'll give it the subtitle that we got here. So save and refresh. And now we can see that our list items have a subtitle right there. Why don't we give it a little bit of style? Let's say align items center. And let's set some padding vertical of 10. Okay, so there's our subtitle. Now what we want to do is animate the height of the subtitle. So the first thing we need to do is change this from a view to an animated.view. If we don't do that, then we won't be able to use our animated.value on that view, which remember is this up here, this list item height. You'll get an error if you try to set a height to a regular view. And by the way, the reason we couldn't do an animated.icon is because icon isn't supported by that, so that's why we needed to use the animated.createAnimated component instead. So if you're wondering why that was a little bit different. All right, now we need to add the height in our animated.view style. So here we'll set the height, and we'll set it equal to this.listItemHeight. And this animation will actually be a little bit easier than the icon one because we don't need to do an interpolation. So as a recap here, I'm setting my animated.view. I'm giving it a style whose height is equal to the list item height, which remember is the animated.value that we started at 0. Because when we start off, we want it to be completely invisible. So if we give it a height of 0, it won't be visible at all. And we're going to change that height to, let's make it about 100 so that it will expand to that size. And then I'm just setting the align item center and padding vertical to make it look nicer, but I'll go ahead and delete that to avoid any confusion. Okay, so save and refresh, make sure we're not getting any errors. This is all working still. Okay, so the last thing we need to do is trigger the height animation, and we'll do that in the same place that we triggered the rotation animation, which is on our list item press function. So I'll make a new section of code, and we'll say expand or collapse the list item. And then here we'll do the same thing that we did for our toValue. We'll say var height toValue equals this.state.isExpanded. I'm using the ternary operator here. And we'll say that if it is expanded, then the new value that we want is 0 because we want to go from expanded to not expanded. And if it is not expanded, then the new value that we want is 100. And I'm just picking that number, just guessing at what size we might want it to be. But like I said, that's something we can tweak later. All right, and then once again, we will use the animated.timing function, and we'll give it this list item height and pass in an object with a to value equal to height to value. And a duration, we'll also set that to be 200 so that these animations will take the same amount of time. And in order to get the animation to actually begin, you have to call .start on that object. Okay, so let's save and refresh and see how that works. All right, now when I click on my list items, you can see that they are expanding and collapsing, and rather than just suddenly getting bigger and suddenly getting smaller, they actually stretch in a nice smooth animation style. Now the last thing I want to do that I just noticed is I don't really like how these chevrons come down and fill the center of the content. I'd like the chevrons to stay in place. So I'm going to come down here to the Chevron styles. Let's see, right here, here's where we have the rotate style, and I'm going to add an additional style so I can put this in an array, and I can add additional styles on like that, and I'm just going to say align self flex start, and hopefully that should make it always stay at the top of the content. Perfect. Okay, and we can make some adjustments to this later as we put content in here, but for now that's a quick and easy way to implement animations using React Native. Thanks for watching the video.